I'm from a region that is historically a mixed forest. It still looks like this in some places, not in Toronto where I live, but my background is in architecture, but I grew up guiding canoe trips and building stud frame houses. So my angle in architecture leans towards these interests. I'm not from Texas, and before coming to Austin on Saturday, I'd only driven through the Panhandle. So my impression of Texas was basically like a very flat tilt to the land as far as I could see. So I don't really know much about what goes on here. And the projects I'm going to show are not applicable everywhere. But what I'm going to talk mostly about is the material connection between architecture and landscapes. And this is largely going to be focused on forests and trees, which exist on very large scales of time. So I'd like to introduce a metric for time that I think helps us relate to their longevity. This is my grandma, but not my actual grandma. This is 3D printed. So yeah, she was in a scanning booth. I don't think she knew what was happening, so she started doing a little dance. She passed away a few years ago at 97, which is close to a century. So like a good long life if we're lucky. So let's call my grandma the metric for 1 century. One grandma ago, the first transatlantic phone call was made between New York and London, and when she was born, this is what a phone used to look like. 2 grandmothers ago, a guy in France poked a hole in a box and made the first photograph. 6 grandmothers ago, Cortez invaded Tenochtitlan, present-day Mexico City, and set in motion a very different course of history for the Americas. 11 grandmothers ago, the first university was founded in Morocco. 20 grandmothers ago, Christ was born and later crucified by the Roman Empire, marking the origin year of our calendar system. 46 grandmothers ago, the Giza pyramids were under construction. And 48 grandmothers ago, this bristlecone pine germinated on top of a mountain in California. 90 grandmas ago, this Norway spruce germinated, and for the majority of its 9,000 years, it lived as a shrub and has only recently sprouted this 60-year-old stem due to changing climate conditions. 100 grandmas ago, cities like New York and Toronto were buried under a mile of ice. And this is the last one I'm going to do, but everything in yellow here is a quaking aspen named Pando in Utah, I think, which is estimated to be anywhere between 160 and 800 grandmas, so somewhere between 16,000 and 80,000 years old. The main question I want to think about with this lecture is, how does architectural design affect the species mix of commercial forests? There are proposals for tall wood emerging everywhere, and engineered wood products are now competing with steel and concrete. And while proposals may have different takes on using mass timber, there's one major factor in common. They're all this very similar even tone of light beige, because only a handful of species are being used in producing mass timber. This is an 18-story mass timber tower called Brock Commons at the University of British Columbia's campus in Vancouver. And these are generally the same species that are used in stud frame. I'm not gonna hate on stud frame or mass timber. I love stud frame. There's lots of new WikiHouse style proposals for new building systems that say they're vaguely more sustainable as a building system, but I'd love to see the metrics because I have real doubts they beat stud frame. This is a very hard system to compete with. It's very efficient. This is the American Pavilion at the Biennale in 2021, and it's my favorite building at the Biennale ever. But that even light beige tone highlights the fact that we are building timber structures with monocultures. Here's a headline from Arc Daily that asks, is mass timber the key element in a low carbon future? Maybe, but I'd say the answer really depends on the structure of forests supplying the material. These are our options for substantial building structures. You have steel, reinforced concrete, and wood. With wood, however, by doing some carbon accounting, we can say timber structures are potentially carbon negative. Producing engineered wood products requires a very small fraction of the energy required for concrete or steel alternatives. The energy input into timber products is mostly in harvesting, drying, manufacturing, adhesives, and transport. I've worked a bit with green timber, and as another option, it's a very minor fraction of the energy used in other timber products. Time is the key factor for wooden structures to become carbon negative, as of course they're carbon positive right out of the gates, but after 46 years, they pay themselves off, and after 91 years, they're carbon negative by the amount emitted in their production. And this idea relies on the land the trees grew on being replanted. The metric used for this is that 1 cubic meter of wood in building products stores 1 ton of carbon. This math might seem confusing at first because 1 cubic meter of wood weighs only half a ton and is only 25% carbon in composition. 1 ton of carbon is not literally stored in the half-ton wood elements. The factor considers how the tree transforms carbon equivalents into other materials and sheds leaves over its lifetime. So timber products are more energy efficient in their production than other alternatives, but are they as strong? You could ask why we build primarily with softwoods if hardwoods are stronger. Apart from the fact that softwoods grow faster and straighter, it really comes down to their strength to weight ratio, where hardwoods begin to outperform concrete, but softwoods actually begin to overlap with steel. So a piece of timber and a piece of steel that share the same dimensions, the steel wins, but when elements are normalized by density, they can compete with each other. The more we modify the timber to gain control over it, the more it loses its inherent strength. Timber in the round is at its strongest, whereas MDF is just dust, and you can make it into any shape you want with adhesives. Timber's strength depends on the direction and continuity of its fibers. The fibers are locally adapted to forces, which occurs differently in hardwoods and softwoods. In hardwoods, the cells shed a layer and begin to pull on the tree to correct its growth. In softwoods, the cells swell and push on the tree. This local adaptation is called reaction wood, where in hardwoods, tension wood forms through cell adaptation on the top side of the branch, reinforcing a cantilever through tension. In softwoods, the reaction wood is called compression wood and forms on the bottom side of the branch, reinforcing cantilevers by compression, often resulting in forms that look buttressed. And when you cut into reaction wood, it goes very wonky because all the forces that accumulated in it over its growth are all released. So while it's inherently very strong, it's generally not considered good for construction. Despite the fact that there are very few examples of structures that use timber in tension, timber in the round performs twice as well in tension as it does in compression. When you mill it into a square element, the removal of the outer tension fibers in milling results in losses of up to 70% of the log's original strength. I want to consider longevity for a moment. This is the oldest steel building, built 288 years ago. With the right maintenance, steel structures can last centuries, if not potentially indefinitely. And this isn't the oldest reinforced concrete building in the world, but it's the oldest tower at 122 years. Concrete alone could probably last forever, but because it has very little strength and tension, slabs rely on rebar, which is susceptible to corrosion given any moisture in the concrete. So if the steel rusts, then the spans will fail. Timber, like concrete or steel, fails with poor protection from the elements, but when detailed well, can last for millennia. This is the oldest known timber structure at 1,300 years, called Oryuji Temple. Some of the Japanese cypress used in its construction were 2,000 years old when they were cut, so having germinated some 3,200 years ago. We have better methods of timber preservation than we did 1,300 years ago. So with the correct species, the right methods of preservation and maintenance observed, longevity of timber structure shouldn't really be a huge question. If we consider building an 18-story timber building like the Brock Commons at UBC, a quick and dirty estimate of volume has us at roughly 5,200 cubic meters of timber for the structure. If this is built with a species like Sitka spruce, considering average growth rates and spacing, this requires somewhere around 28 acres of land over the span of 50 years of growth. So that might not seem too bad considering how many people the building houses. But the result might look something like this. Clear cutting has a number of negative implications for the land. To name a few, there's no remaining intact ecology to nourish and replenish the soil. There's no root structure to hold the form of the land in place, leading to landslides and flooding. The soil is exposed to the sun, drying it out and making it harder to replant, and the leftover biomass is likewise exposed, drying out and fueling fires. There's roughly 850 million hectares of forest and wooded land in North America. As I said earlier, I don't know a huge amount about Texas, but I did a little research before coming. And I think you deserve way more hype about your forests. You have twice as much forest as California, and those ones get all the attention. Texas has 25 million hectares, which amounts to 3% of the forest in North America. Of that 25 million, something like 5.5 million is dedicated to commercial forestry, accounting for roughly 3% of the commercial forestry in the US. And this is mostly planted with a handful of species, predominantly softwoods, with loblolly pine being the most common. I'm not singling out Texas with this image. This is a global issue, but I think you can see that the argument is leading to the idea that single species plantations might pose future risks. This is an analogy I'm borrowing from an ecologist friend. Picture the state of a landscape as a ball in a cup. The depth of the cup is representing biodiversity. If there's environmental turbulence, it's easy for the ball to leave a shallow cup and transition from a forest to a grassland to a desert. If the cup is deep, meaning lots of interconnected relationships between different organisms, it's harder for the ball to leave the cup and the land to transition states. It's a rough analogy, but biodiversity is critical to long-term resilience. Fires are a massive threat to forests, so I'd like to discuss them a bit. And to do that, I want to look at how we would create a very good campfire. The first step in creating a good campfire is ignition, so you might have a lighter or some flint. The source of ignition in forest fires is estimated at roughly 50-50 lightning strikes versus human cause. That's from Canadian data. Lightning strikes are predicted to increase with a warming climate at a rate of 12% per degree of warming. So with warmer climates, more ignition. Next, we can use tinder to hold the flame. And if you've ever walked around a softwood plantation, you'll note that the whole floor is covered in dry needles, which are highly explosive. Small twigs are really good kindling that help carry the flame to larger fuel. And good airflow between the fuel helps feed oxygen into the fire. And if you're not doing so well at this, you can use gasoline. And in softwoods, the resins which sit just below the bark are very flammable, a bit like oil. These are the 2023 fires in Quebec, which smoked out New York and Washington for a few days. And from what I can tell using satellite images, the majority of these sites are actually commercial. So the wildfire term might be a bit misleading. And that's a big problem because roughly 1 billion hectares globally, or 30% of the world's forests are production forests. And not all of these are single species necessarily, but a significant amount are. Before I place all the blame on fire, I want to highlight the positive role of fire in forests. Some trees are very well adapted to fire, with others actually relying on it for their reproduction. Mature trees are more resistant to fire than young ones, and old-growth forests are more adapted to fire than young plantations. These are coastal redwoods, who will wait up to 20 years for a fire to assist in releasing their seeds. Red pine and white pine forests are very well adapted to surface fires that spread quickly across the ground, facilitated by a thin layer of their needles. Jack pine actually retain their low-lying branches to bring the fire up into the upper canopy, which kills them, but their seeds release at 660 degrees Fahrenheit. So without fires to facilitate reproduction, they would be replaced by other species. Most of the fires we hear about are destructive, out-of-control burns, particularly ones that affect or burn into communities. The LA wildfires this year are an example. There are many factors that lead towards these types of fires. Warming climate and drought are major ones. Another is the historic suppression of fire on managed land over the past century or more. And I can understand that. Like, if you grow something to sell, it makes sense to prevent it from burning down. But fire suppression results in the buildup of excess fuels that cause even adapted species or mature trees to ignite. This is a region just east of the Rockies in British Columbia, where even age stands are harvested through clear felling on a rotating cycle. And you can kind of see the pattern of industry through that landscape. With newly planted plots, the trees haven't developed bark thick enough to protect the resins from fire, making these trees very vulnerable. And if you zoom out, this is that region in the summer of 2023. When we hear about fire in the media, it's usually when it affects cities or travel plans, and often it's quite sensational. But we hear less about the locations of the fires themselves, particularly fires in the boreal forest in Russia and Canada, where the most amount of tree cover is lost to fires. These are a few fires in Alaska, Canada, and Russia in remote areas that are extremely hard to access and put out. So the policy is kind of let them put themselves out. And the way we measure damage from fire is likewise centered around our welfare. So measured in the amount of buildings burned, number of people evacuated, how many people have died, how many emergency firefighters are on the ground, or what countries have lent firefighting support. Another metric is carbon. So this graph takes us to the end of July in Canada at July 2023 in Canada at 290 megatons of carbon released by fire. And by the end of September 2023, that number was actually 2,000 megatons. Ways to contextualize that number are to compare it to Canada's reported emissions for 2023 at just over a quarter of the fire's emissions, and global air travel at roughly half. 57% of that was on unmanaged land, 43% in managed forests. And I find the fact that this ratio is close to 50-50 is really concerning, because managed land has clearly defined routes of access to each plot and fire management strategies in place, whereas remote regions don't. So there's this idea that we are working with right now, like we can work with forests to sequester carbon, store it in building products, and use our buildings as a carbon sink. But if the source of that is a super emitter, it doesn't fully work as a model. There is a potential solution being shown to us by wild burn sites. So black spruce is a dominant species in the boreal forests of Canada and Alaska, and like the sequoia, it relies on fire to release seeds. The intensity of the fires occurring in the boreal forest moves beyond the point of facilitating their reproduction, and the forest is starting to adapt to that. Over a 13-year study at 89 burn sites in Alaska, a succession pattern developed where 71% of the sites switched post-burn from dominant black spruce to a mixed forest with dominant deciduous aspen and birch, which are less flammable trees than black spruce. The aspen and birch also store carbon at a rate 4 times faster than black spruce. And it's noted in this study that projected out over the next 50 years, the succession trees could resequester the carbon being released now in the boreal forest. Similar succession patterns happen on managed plots. However, the incoming trees are not seen as commercially viable. So the emergence of these trees is suppressed through chemical treatments, the way you kind of weed your garden. So mixed forests are being recognized as natural barriers to the explosive growth of fires seen in more homogeneous landscapes. Mixed forests don't burn as well because of the mix of fuel types, densities, and ages of the trees. So basically diversity is very bad for fires, but very good for forest health. So when we say we're working with forests to sequester carbon, we need to work at understanding what forests actually want to be and what they will become in the future. And realistically, for this to change, it requires transformation across multiple industries. So as designers, I wonder if we could look back through these industries through both speculation and spec writing to change the forest. Continuous cover forestry is a management style that fits this relationship. It's not very common yet in North America, but it's becoming more common in Europe. And the idea is really in the name continuous cover. The land is never clear-felled. It has multiple ages, densities, and species on the same site, and uses natural regeneration for continuous growth. From the forestry side, the practice is a bit more like gardening. It's a longer-term planning model than clear felling, but far more resilient as an ecology. Clear felling in the short term will produce more biomass, but continuous cover in the longer term produces roughly the same or potentially more. You just have to plan, manage, and wait for a bit longer. So in order to think about what a new relationship could look like, I want to briefly examine the relationship between a few vernacular building methods and their resource landscapes. And I'm not in any way advocating for a return to older ways of building or older styles of architecture, but we've been making timber structures for close to something like 500,000 years. So the fact that forests still exist mean that there may be some wisdom in relationships we've had with the landscapes over that span of time. Production landscapes, tooling, and architecture exist in states of co-evolution. What materials are available and how we are able to manipulate them informs the design of tools and the methods of industry, which in turn reshape the management structure of landscape to fit production models. Both resource and industry define what is available to produce buildings with, which eventually exerts forces through trends or movements on the demand for resources and how they are made into building components. On the left is a hardwood cruck frame home in England called the Seagull House, and on the right is the Katsura Imperial Villa in Japan. These spaces both have very defined architectural, structural, and spatial languages, and although these languages are very different, they share a similar relation between their architectural form and the local ecosystems. On the left is a hardwood forest in England, and on the right is a softwood forest in Japan. If your production is entirely manual, how much you are able to efficiently alter the material is a key consideration. There becomes a compromise between the form of the architecture and the original form of the material. And if you know through experience the effort required to transform the resource into the architectural element, you'll have a strong sense of the labor economy involved, and consequently your embodied knowledge will alter the way that you design. Neither of those landscapes, the British forest or the Japanese forest, are entirely natural. So Japanese forests are historically mixed with conifers dominant in the north, but the availability and preference for building with softwood led to deforestation and reforestation with preferred species. Out of this came a style of timber production called daisugi, meaning platform cedar. This technique was developed sometime in the 16th century in a mountainous region where deforestation was leading to soil erosion. So they created a technique for growing high-quality construction-grade timber where you didn't have to kill the tree. They trained the cedars upwards into an elevated platform and then trained the new growth upwards so that new growth could be harvested in cycles for building components. This technique has its parallel in other regions of the world. In England, a technique called coppicing relies on the tree's ability to regenerate from the stump. There are a few conifers that can do this, but most of the species that are capable of this kind of regeneration are hardwoods. So the image above on the left shows a patch of coppice alder where there are up to 6 trees per stump. The trees are aged at roughly 60 years, but the stumps and roots are much older, and these have been harvested on cycles. One of the oldest trees in England is a 2,000-year-old coppice lime tree, which is managed on a 20-year cycle and was coppiced last in 2012. So this image is probably 10 years of growth, but all of that is connected through an underground root system that is up to 2,000 years old. So both the European cruck frame and the Japanese post and beam structures have very complex joinery systems. Japanese joinery gets a lot of love for its complexity and precision, rightly so for sure. A joint, however, is the process of translating force into geometry at the point of connection. And joints similar to those listed in Japanese joinery books have evolved in many places. The example on the left is from Cecil Hewitt's book on English historic carpentry. In Japan, some historical structures are periodically dismantled and reconstructed, for which they have construction companies founded up to 1,400 years ago that pass on knowledge so the tradition remains alive. Whereas in England, historical structures are protected and can't be taken apart, so it's much more difficult to study the joinery that was used. Congo Gumi is considered the world's longest continually operating business. So their company motto states a very clear objective: the inheritance of techniques from 1,400 years ago to the future. They are temple building specialists, more recently pioneering the use of digital technology in the restoration and construction of temples. Traditional British framing techniques were essentially revived in the 1980s by Charlie Bretonall, who founded a company called Carpenter Oak. He was originally trained in ceramics. His interest in ancient timber framing methods stemmed from a project he conducted with students where they dismantled and rebuilt a medieval barn. And likely through its deconstruction, they learned about older joinery traditions. He recently passed away, sadly, but in his last years co-founded a company called Xylotech, who are among the most advanced timber specialists in the world. I visited the Schindler House recently in LA, built in 1922. And although inspired by the layout of a Yosemite campsite, has a very Japanese appearance to it. Fleeing 1930s Germany, Bruno Tott spent 3 years in Japan where he studied the parallels between Japanese design, Katsura in particular, and the emergence of a progressive style that had been emerging in Europe around the removal of traditional facades from contemporary structural technologies. In 1955, Walter Gropius visited Katsura for the first time, reflecting in his postcard to Corbusier that everything we have fought for is paralleled in ancient Japanese culture. Whether influenced or not, Mise's obsession with units and modules has strong parallels to the planning at Katsura and the aggregation of tatami as the fundamental unit in older Japanese planning. The new building technology that modernists were looking to reveal was essentially a component library of extrusions and sheet material, which likewise are essentially the basis of the Katsura era material palette. To be clear though, this is the landscape of the modern material library, and these are the tools that are used. And this is the vernacular, if you call it vernacular, by relationship to a global material ecosystem. Okay, I'll show a few projects now, one that I did when I was a student and a few that I did with students. This is Hook Park in England, a 300-acre forested satellite campus for the Architectural Association's School of Architecture in London. It's a very special place. I was lucky enough to spend 4 years of my life here, and I'll probably go back for another month this summer. The surrounding area has a very rich history of Iron Age settlements, henges, and ancient woodlands. Just to the north of here, about a 2-hour drive along the coast of Devon, are fossils of the oldest known forest on Earth, dating back 390 million years. Sometime in the 1200s, the land was shaped as a hunting park to enclose game animals for land-owning aristocracy. And around this time, the woods were managed in part through coppicing, which you can see on the left. This initial shaping of the land 800 years ago is still effectively keeping in the deer. So now their population is managed through hunting contracts to protect the forest. The land used to be owned by and now borders with the Mapperton estate, which is the family seat of the Earl of Sandwich, and notably the 4th Earl of Sandwich invented the sandwich so he could continue eating while gambling. Hook's coppicing and ancient woods were clear-felled post-war in 1946. So almost clean slate. There's still a couple patches of ancient woodland and coppicing. And it was replanted with 2 species, Norway spruce and beech. The softwood to sustain the building industry, the hardwood to sustain furniture. In the 80s and 90s, the property was redeveloped as a visionary furniture school where education included a knowledge of the resource itself in addition to the trade. This photo of the entrance shows the old gates, which were an early Andy Goldsworthy sculpture. And since then, there's been a concerted effort, primarily through Hook's forester Chris Saad, to diversify the species mix. There are currently 15 or more intentionally planned species, with a focus now on a 100-year strategy for the forest management. Post-war, it would have been managed through clear felling. Now it's transitioning more towards a continuous cover model and increased biodiversity. The buildings that housed the furniture school were experiments in the structural potential of forestry byproducts. The first 2, the workshop and the prototype house, are Fry auto structures using small diameter cull timber from the spruce quadrants. So the workshop was made by incrementally cold bending the green timber poles into a shell structure. Was it under construction? And the prototype house leverages round timber strength and tension with a tensile roof. So these first 2 projects really set the agenda for decades to come. And in the early 2000s, the property was acquired by the Architectural Association, and in 2011, the Design Make Degree program was set up with the Big Shed as its inaugural project. The Big Shed is the building that we make the other buildings in. So with this agenda of learning the material first, a new lens is developed. While we have some engineers in the teaching staff, most of us are designers. And one of the best ways to get a quick and intuitive sense of materials is by a sense of feeling and seeing. Seeing a building's components in a standing tree is an ancient tradition with strong ties to medieval barn and church architecture, as well as Viking shipbuilding. So this project is called the Woodland Cabin, and it's one I worked on as a student. The project was made by a team of 5 of us, so agreeing on what we wanted to do was often half the battle. So this diagram tracks and distills the topics that we were interested in. And we all know documentation is key in architectural education, but when you're building it, video is probably the best medium. So this shows the harvesting process for a few of the trees we used. This is the forester Chris felling a few ash trees. Tracking what we cut down and where waste went was eye-opening to us as students. And perhaps even more interesting was tracking the timber's regrowth rate. These are yield class curves, which are forestry tools for estimating volume production based on a series of parameters about the tree and the land. For example, within the spruce quadrants that we harvested from, 164 cubic meters is produced annually on 24 acres of land. So that's 164 added on in volume. We used 5 cubic meters of spruce, which amounts to 3% of the area's annual growth, or roughly 11 days of growth if you space out the growth throughout the year. We were using photogrammetry to document the original form of the material. And we developed algorithms that set datums and the general logic and alignment and geometry of the building. This allowed us to locate and plan for a series of very precise joints on the building's more organic elements. These are basically the key controls for the building. So there's the height of the foundations below, which are all different, and then there's the height and dimensions of the floor, top of wall, and skylight. These are offset for the envelope, and these are the key datums and points of connection for aligning the natural forms. First, we draw a wireframe to guide the organic elements into position, and then a couple of geometry translations snap the center lines of the trees into place. And then following that same geometry translation, the scans of the trees follow the center lines. So then we can begin to design and detail the connections between the elements, map out the framing, and generate all the final building geometry. And all of that is remaining responsive to the original datum set. So if we, at the last minute, need to change the height of the building or the size of the skylight, all of the geometry follows, including the material cut list. So as a last step to those algorithms, all the geometry is laid flat and along with their stock volumes. And we get a spreadsheet for requesting timber from the sawmill. So while the building was planned through fairly intensive digital processes, it was designed by hand. We spent a lot of time playing with small twigs, quickly iterating through a large set of possible avenues, and finally landing on this model. The logic in this design was to make the organic forms work as hard as possible for us. And I don't really mean that structurally, because this is probably a bit overbuilt. Rather than setting datums through the milled elements, we thought it was more interesting to have the datums registered on the natural forms. All the milled components find their global positioning through joints on the tree forks. So when we began setting this out, we were pretty blown away by the accuracy we were getting. For example, it's the natural geometry that touches the ground and has the floor bridging them. Once situated together on site, we found the floor already level. We didn't need to shim it. And when we measured from known points on the floor up to joints on the forks, distances of up to 5-6 meters, they were within about a few millimeters of where we expected in the digital model. So of course we were careful. So like that's in part due to us like being careful in measuring things twice. But the datums registered on the natural timber were made by a robotic arm. So positionally, the joints are accurate to each other, but the timber can kind of swim between those positions. And as long as there's enough timber colliding with the joints, we're good. The robot was great for locating the joints, but we always did a bit of final cleanup by hand with chisels. Each of these columns was flip milled, with some of the columns even having multiple positions per side. So with each new position, you're recalibrating the piece. Most of the time, things lined up really well. I think the largest step we had from flip milling was about 2 mil. We were using 2 tools, a chainsaw for big clearing cuts, and a router for the more intricate joinery. So this project was completed within a year. Most of that's research and planning. And we started fabricating, starting in January, we actually started fabricating in September, everything being prefabricated in the big sheds. We spent about a week on site installing. And you wouldn't necessarily know it walking in, but I think the thing I'm happiest with in this project is that I can see my colleagues very clearly in it. group work in an academic setting can be really challenging, especially when everyone has diverging research agendas. So having something built that together fuses all of these in a way that isn't necessarily noticeable feels quite special. It has a second height space formed by a net. You have to climb to get up to it. And while it's a nice space, it's nice to sleep there, the net is actually like a key part in our assembly sequence because we didn't want to have to budget for scaffolding. So we installed a rated net to be able to access second height spaces as a work platform. May not look like a demountable structure, but there's 10 pieces in this design that connect to each other through timber connections. So if the school needs to move the building in the future, it will come apart with each element liftable by on-site equipment. So this was the first project I did as teaching staff. This is the field station, and it's the furthest away from the campus core that we've built and serves as a research outpost within the landscape. And the story of this building really begins with this piece of equipment called a harvester. It's basically a really dexterous hand with a chainsaw for like its pinky. The volume's not playing there, but. So I don't have a video of it stripping down an entire tree, but it's a very fast thing to watch. It's largely automated. It grabs the tree, uses a series of wheels with teeth to pull the tree through it and clips it up at 5-meter lengths and stacks it into a neat pile. As it strips down a tree, it leaves behind a lot of debris in its wake. And so for the field station, this is the material we were interested in. What does the harvester leave behind in the forest? So the students designed the project around using small diameter timber branches, roughly 5 centimeters wide, as the bracing members in a space frame assembly. Every branch is unique. There's, I think, 256 branches. But the 2 points of connection to the structure are standardized. So we developed a robotic workflow to largely automate the production of these bracing elements. So this begins with scanning the branches to document their geometry, and then aligning them to a standardized component model to generate toolpaths for a robotic arm. So that's a standardized component, and the toolpaths remain the same per piece, but with different orientations, because the pieces are all unique and held in different orientations. So in this application, the arm is holding the material, bringing it to the cutting tool. The tool is a handheld Makita skill saw, common in timber framing, but mounted to an old cast steel bowl lathe that one of the robot's external motors is hooked up to. And it's actually essential for the tool to be able to increment at different angles. With 12 or more cuts per piece, there's no way to actually reach all the different positions with the robot if the saw was static. And getting this to work took a lot of testing and calibration, obviously. Once working, though, the tolerances were under 0.5 millimeter. So the robot is basically contorting itself into a whole bunch of different positions to reach the cut. And the errors in its own body design compound. So without any kind of digital correction, the cuts were up to 3 or 4 millimeters out. But the error was repeatable, so it could be corrected digitally by measuring and tracking the error. So that's how we got it down to about 0.5 mil. Before letting the students build the final piece, we usually set a target of having a 1-to-1 prototype made. So for this project, we used the AA's open day, I think it's like in June, as a target to have a pavilion made that could be dismantled and shipped to London. The robot was tied up making the bracing members, so for this project, the natural timber columns were made entirely by hand and without even scanning the pieces. Within the design of the pavilion, we mapped out triangles that represented the plane that a fork would sit on and where it connects to the structure. And then we mapped those out on the floor using tape, and then brought the forks to the triangle and fitted into the triangle by eye, and brought cutting jigs to the tape to scribe joints and cut joints. And this was actually a really accurate and intuitive way to work. Once the pavilion was assembled, the columns held the roof within about a few millimeters of where we expected. This drawing by one of the students, Roman, situates the project in the context of its predecessors at Hook, with different projects working their way up the full tree to showcase uses of non-standard timber. The field station kind of sits at the top using the crown timber. We liked to say this project could be flat packed and demounted, but it's really as flat as you can get branches, which aren't that flat. And since the project was assembled away from the core campus, we were without power and a 15-minute walk away from the workshop. So the set of tools used in assembly was a strong feature of the project's design considerations. Roman even made the number 15 spanner a design feature of an augmented branch that's in the pavilion or in the building. So this assembly is essentially a large puzzle with primarily wood-to-wood connections between elements. At each node, there's tension rods, which kind of squeeze down the top and bottom layers of cords onto the round branches, forcing them all into compression. The roof was roughly 4 tons, so we needed a crane. We were all a bit nervous about the spans and maybe the roof sagging over time. But when it landed on the columns, I was really listening for the sound of timber creaking or groaning as the crane came off. But it was actually silent, meaning it worked. And we had to throw a good party to celebrate this one. In the design, we were really trying to show off the spans that we could achieve with this. And so there are only 3 columns that hold up the structure, and they're kind of in a little circle in the middle. But as you can imagine, that creates a bit of a pivot point on one side. So we have a very slender aluminum scaffold post that ties the structure back to the ground to resolve any wind load issues. Scaling up a bit, this is the 3rd build focused on Wakeford Hall, which is a flagship project for the campus. 2 generations of students previously completed the library portion, and this 3rd generation focused on the load-bearing structure and roof spanning a lecture hall and new administration facilities. This is the team. These are all the students. So like with the field station, we had the students make a 1-to-1 mock-up. They had spent their first term ideating on the structural system. So we said for term 2, let's make a full-scale building section. And we had a really nice target with this one. Peter Barber was curating the architecture room at the Royal Academy's summer show that year, and he reached out to us and asked if we could build the biggest thing possible for that room. And the students really crushed it with this one. The RA gave us 2 days for the install, and they had it done in a morning. We kept sending revised designs to Peter's team, and their feedback each time was basically like, can you make it bigger? So that was it in the summer show. We also had to get a little bigger with the saw setup. using the same robotic workflow from the field station for the kind of diagonal truss elements. Only this time incorporating changes in length of the elements and the joint angles. So the pieces grew up to 100 millimeters in diameter, so the saw had to get more robust than the little Makita. There's a number of really nice techniques coming together in this structure. In the first term, the students set the ambition of only timber, no steel. And all of us on staff and the engineers were like, yeah, that's a really nice goal, but you're gonna have to use steel somewhere. So think about where you're willing to compromise. And they weren't willing to compromise. So to their credit, they tested the shit out of their connections and satisfied the engineering team at ARUP. And there's no steel in this structure. The other robotic workflow we use in this project was the chainsaw. We don't have automatic tool changing, so switching between the chainsaw and a router is actually really time consuming when you have to do it for every piece. So we set the chainsaw as a fabrication constraint for several of the elements, which in turn informed the design and detailing of those elements and their connections. This is one of 10 foundation pieces we made by extracting geometry from the stumps of cedar trees. When we started doing this, the production time on these pieces was like a day, because we were doing one cut at a time. We didn't have like oil drip feed on the chainsaw for lubricants, but we got those things set up and got the time of one element down to about half an hour. These are the columns, which likewise were fabricated using the chainsaw. At the bottom, these columns connect into that foundation element. So both of those are made on the chainsaw, so the joints might need a little hand touch-up, but they're pretty much good at it as is. At the top, they connect to engineered timber, which has been processed with a router bit on the CNC. So for those connections, we use the chainsaw to rough out the joints and create reference surfaces for a routing jig that clipped onto the reference surfaces and guided a router around the final joint surfaces. We also tested out on these pieces a relief cut to guide splitting in the wood. This is probably my favorite part of it. And yeah, the relief cuts actually worked to guide the checks in the timber. So here's some of those components. You have robotic chainsaw milled cedar, minimally processed natural timber in European beech, and engineered timber in Norway spruce. And here they are assembled with timber-to-timber connections. There are 5 of these linear truss assemblies that hold up the roof. All 5 have been completed but not yet installed, so they're getting installed this summer. This is some ongoing research I'm doing in ornamenting natural timber. And it came out of a project I was doing for a firm in Toronto, Brooke McElroy. We were working on a feature wood wall that had carved wood textures. And once we did that feature wall, we started wondering, could we wrap natural timber in these textures? And the first few attempts at this didn't really work all that well. So you can see in the left image a section where it's fully textured, which I found didn't read well, so there's kind of too much going on. So I started playing around with offsetting the geometry of the natural timber with smaller effects designed based on the geometry of router bits. This attempt I still found too busy, but the idea in this one was also mixed with having the patterning informed by music. So the oval-shaped depressions are drum hits from a song one of my colleagues recorded. The technique of mapping geometry to the timber surface starts out with gridding it off and then accessing parts of the grid to plan geometry from. This is a third test based on diamond patterning that a colleague of mine was working with. And so it's like a V-shaped bit, and it travels in a V-shaped path to create a diamond. This fourth one is the most recent one I've done, and to me, it's the most successful. This one I ran as a workshop for students on exploring aesthetic potential of natural timber. I'm really interested in this idea of blending the natural timber with milled timber, and this comes from the fact that the form of a tree is really familiar to us, and so is the look of wood. But the two things remain very disconnected, both in appearance, but also their emotional value to us. No one wants to cut down a tree, especially if you haven't seen it done or cut one down yourself, but everyone loves to have wood in their home. So it's kind of like the idea, if you can eat meat, can you kill the animal? So for me, this test is the closest I've got to a representation of this, but it's still something that's in progress. And this is the last project I'll show, and it's definitely the most manual. It was an exercise I did with first years at the AA as a carpentry introduction. And I showed an image of coppice alder before. This is the same patch of forest that the timber for this project comes from. And the nice thing about engaging with coppice timber is that it will grow back. I found this kind of fun, so like thinking back to my first week of architecture school in undergrad, on the first day of their classes, this is the pile of timber the students got, and I told them they had to make a dome. So when picking the timber, I was looking for trees that had multiple bends in them to serve as multiple components within the dome. There were two rough radiuses and lengths I was looking for, so they both had to be present in a tree to qualify it for felling. And this is Chris Saad, the hook forester, felling one of those trees. Felling trees is actually really dangerous. Some of those students came to visit Hook and got a quick education in forestry, but maybe more importantly, an introduction to the fact that this resource is available at the AA. The first exercise was in splitting. We didn't have enough metal wedges to go around, so there's lots of wood wedges being used. And this was mainly about having the students feel the force locked inside the timber and how much strength in their body was required to break it. They didn't get all the way through splitting, so I had to finish it with a chainsaw. And we stored the timber in its original configuration so that as it dries, the forces released in the logs could resist against each other to prevent warping. They had to nominally flatten the logs to 50 mil, and the AA didn't have a planer big enough to do this in their workshop, so I thought this would be good practice with chisels. I don't have any photos of that because it was like complete chaos. But they did get really good with chisels very quickly. So I gave them these templates to shape the timber and locate joints, and those were shaped on a bandsaw, and the lap joints roughed out. And the students were each working on individual pieces, and although they knew it would come together as a dome, I think understandably they had some doubts that it would in fact be a dome at the end. But by this class they got really excited because they could start seeing the pieces come together and the dome cap forming. On the last class we stayed late to finish assembling, but by this point they'd pretty much just taken ownership of the project and were very confident with the tools. We kept it here in one of the courtyards for their review. And then the school asked us to put it up on one of the terraces, so we demounted it and carried it up and reassembled. And I apologize, I've forgotten to put a photo in here, but I've passed this project off to a friend of mine, Finn, who ran it last fall, and he's carried on the project, and every year they're adding new elements to this dome. So with all of these projects, what all these projects represent is a new and very old relationship with the landscape, and also a new and old way of practicing architecture. I don't want to present these as a solution to anything in particular, but rather as a way of seeing our work as an extension of the earth, not aesthetically, just very literally. Knowing that our buildings are a reflection of ecosystems, it's important to consider the state we want those ecosystems to exist in and what architecture could result out of that. So while it's really nice to also be here presenting this work, credit's due to a very large team, especially the multiple generations of design and make students who worked on these projects, and past and present staff at Hook, Emmanuel Veracruz, Kate Davies, Martin Self, Zach Malika, Charlie Quarry-Wright, Chris Sad, Edward Coe, John Nicola Adeki, Sam Turner-Baldwin, and many more people who support these projects. So thanks very much for having me. It was really nice to speak with you. But I think there's maybe a Q&A period.